The stillness in the room was profound. Each man present understood they were witnessing an event that would be recounted for generations. Bumpy Johnson remained motionless at the poker table, his dark gaze locked onto the individual who had just crossed an unforgivable boundary. The ice in his whiskey had yet to melt, but the atmosphere in the room had chilled by 20 degrees. Vincent the Hammer Torino leaned back in his seat, a smug grin spreading across his features. He perceived himself as invincible. After all, he held sway over half the piers in Manhattan, had judges in his employ, and commanded deference from Brooklyn all the way to the Bronx. What could a single man from Harlem possibly do to me? "What's the matter, Bumpy?" Vincent guffawed, his voice reverberating off the walls of the private alcove at Ralph's establishment. Quote 2. The other gentlemen at the table shifted uneasily. They recognized Vincent had just committed a grave error. One could offend a man's livelihood, his attire, even his spouse, if one felt particularly audacious. However, his mother, that was sacred territory, particularly where Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was concerned. Bumpy's fingers tapped once on the green felt surface of the table. Merely once. The sound was barely perceptible, yet it could have been mistaken for a gunshot. He reached into his jacket's interior, not for an armament, but for a photograph. It was aged, its edges softened by time, yet it held immeasurable value. His mother, pictured standing outside their modest dwelling in Charleston, South Carolina, holding the hand of a young Bumpy. "Inform me, Vincent," Bumpy inquired, his voice so placid it was disquieting. "What do you comprehend regarding respect?" Vincent's laughter faltered subtly. Something in Bumpy's tone sent a chill down his spine, yet his arrogance prevented him from retreating now. Not in the presence of his own associates. "I understand sufficiently to identify when someone is undeserving of it," Vincent retorted, gesturing dismissively towards Bumpy. "You fellows from Harlem presume to dictate terms, but you're merely playing dress-up in garments your superiors discarded." The insult lingered in the air like the fumes from a pyre, but Bumpy did not erupt. He did not reach for his firearm. He did not even elevate his voice. Instead, he did something far more unnerving. He smiled. To grasp the events that transpired in that room that evening, one must return to the genesis. To comprehend why Vincent Torino would be discovered 3 weeks later, broken and pleading on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral. It is essential to know the true identity of Bumpy Johnson. Born Ellsworth Johnson in 1905, Bumpy had internalized the dictates of the streets before he could adequately fasten his footwear. His mother, Margaret Johnson, possessed a character that commanded reverence through sheer force of will. She was employed cleaning residences for affluent white families by day and managed illicit lotteries for local syndicates by night. She imparted 2 principles to her son that would profoundly shape his existence. Never forget your origins, and never permit anyone to demean your kin. By 1935, Bumpy had become the most dreaded individual in Harlem, not due to his volubility or his propensity for violence, but because of his superior intellect. While rival syndicates contended for street territory, Bumpy constructed an enterprise founded on fidelity, astuteness, and an unwavering ethical code. He presided over the illicit lottery operations, the protection rackets, and had politicians from City Hall to Washington, D.C., receiving his gratuities. Moreover, he was a champion of the common folk. When families struggled to meet their rent payments, Bumpy provided the funds. When children required educational supplies, they materialized. When law enforcement became excessively heavy-handed in Harlem, they were reassigned to precincts in Staten Island. Vincent Torino, conversely, embodied everything Bumpy found abhorrent about the criminal underworld. Born into affluence, granted authority effortlessly, he governed through dread and brutality rather than esteem and acumen. He viewed Bumpy as nothing more than a street ruffian who had experienced good fortune, a sentiment echoed by many of the Italian families who governed organized crime in New York. However, they were about to discover that fortune played no role in it. As Bumpy sat in that back room, Vincent continued his verbal assault, oblivious to the fact that he was sealing his own doom with every utterance. The other gentlemen at the table, Jimmy the Fish Maroney, Tony Benedetto, and Sal Numbers, Gop, observed with fascination and mounting dread as their leader dug his own grave. Quote 7. Vincent spat, pointing an accusatory digit at Bumpy. Quote 8. Bumpy's smile never wavered. In fact, it seemed to expand. He meticulously returned his mother's photograph to his jacket pocket, placing it precisely over his heart. Then he rose slowly, smoothing down his impeccably tailored suit. Quote 9, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Quote 10. But what Vincent failed to grasp, what none of them apprehended, was that Bumpy had not attended that assembly to play cards. He had come to convey a message, and the message was already in motion, disseminating through the thoroughfares of New York like a conflagration through tinder. The game had shifted, and Bumpy Johnson was poised to instruct everyone precisely what transpired when one showed disrespect to the wrong person's mother. Vincent Torino had no inkling he was already a man walking towards his demise. In his perception, he had merely put a presumptuous street vendor in his place. The laughter from his associates echoed throughout the room as he reveled in what he believed to be his moment of triumph. However, the seasoned criminals at that table sensed a distinct alteration in the atmosphere. Something perilous. "Do you comprehend your transgression, Johnson?" Vincent continued, emboldened by what he mistook for Bumpy's silence as acquiescence. Quote 12. Bumpy remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that might appear casual to an uninformed observer. However, Jimmy the Fish Maroney understood better. He had been in this business for 30 years, and he recognized the stance of a predator preparing to pounce. The manner in which Bumpy's weight was distributed on the balls of his feet, the steadiness of his respiration, despite the invectives being hurled at him. This was not submission. This was strategic calculation. "Tell me something, Vincent," Bumpy proposed, his voice retaining that same disturbing composure. "How is your nephew faring, young Anthony?" The one attending that exclusive academy on the Upper East Side. The color drained from Vincent's countenance. No one was meant to be aware of Anthony. The child was deliberately insulated from the family's criminal enterprise, shielded by layers of security and secrecy. How could this Harlem street thug possibly possess knowledge of him? "Do not dare," Vincent commenced. But Bumpy raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that somehow conveyed greater authority than any vociferous threat. "Compose yourself," Bumpy advised, that smile reappearing on his visage. "I am merely engaging in conversation. After all, family holds importance, does it not? Speaking of which, how is your sister Maria still managing that modest boutique in Little Italy? Such a pleasant woman, always so courteous to her clientele." Vincent's hand moved instinctively towards the concealed firearm in his shoulder holster, But Tony Benedetto grasped his wrist. The elder gentleman had navigated 40 years within the ranks of organized crime. By discerning when to engage and when to listen at this precise moment, every instinct he had honed urged him to attend with utmost care. _19_Bumpy continued, commencing a leisurely perambulation around the table. Observe, Vincent, while you have been ensconced in your petty dominion, deeming yourself invincible, I have been undertaking what sagacious individuals do. I have been acquiring knowledge about you, about your family, about your commercial dealings, about your vulnerabilities. The room had fallen utterly silent, save for the rhythm of Bumpy's footsteps upon the polished wooden floor. With each stride, Vincent's confidence eroded further. This was not the anticipated outcome. He was Vincent the Hammer Torino. He was the one who issued threats. He was the one who held all the leverage. "20 Bumpy inquired, pausing directly behind Vincent's chair. I discovered that you are far less astute than you believe yourself to be. I ascertained that your organization possesses more lacuna than Swiss cheese, and most crucially, I learned that you lack even the slightest comprehension of respect." Vincent twisted in his chair to face Bumpy. His former bravado had been supplanted by an expression that bore a striking resemblance to apprehension. "What is your desire, Johnson?" "Desire?" Bumpy emitted a sound utterly devoid of warmth. "I harbor no desires from you, Vincent. You see, 3 hours prior, upon my entry into this chamber, I already possessed all that I required." The implication hung in the atmosphere like a toxic vapor. 3 hours earlier, preceding the insults, preceding the remarks concerning his mother, Bumpy had arrived already cognizant of the impending events. However, the true terror commenced when Bumpy withdrew another item from his jacket pocket, a compact recording device. The type that had gained popularity among law enforcement agencies, the type capable of capturing every spoken word with pristine clarity. "Do you grasp the splendor of technology?" Bumpy posed, placing the device on the table within everyone's view. "25. Vincent's eyes became fixed upon the device, like a man observing his own execution. Within that small black instrument lay everything. Every insult, every prejudiced epithet, every arrogant boast regarding his illicit undertakings. In the wrong hands, that recording could obliterate not only him, but his entire enterprise. Naturally, Bumpy continued, this particular recording might elicit interest from several parties. The FBI, for instance, they have exhibited considerable curiosity regarding your dock operations, something pertaining to the misappropriation of funds from union pension reserves. And then there is District Attorney Morrison. He has been seeking evidence of malfeasance within the sanitation department. It is peculiar how your name consistently surfaces in those inquiries. The other gentlemen at the table began to comprehend the spectacle they were witnessing. This was not a confrontation. It was not even a negotiation. This was a strategic game of chess that had concluded before it even commenced, and they were only now perceiving the checkmate. But Bumpy was not yet finished. He returned to his chair and sat down, producing a thick manila envelope. From it he extracted a sequence of photographs, monochromatic images that caused Vincent's blood to turn to ice. The initial photograph depicted Vincent engaging with known communist sympathizers at the docks. The second portrayed him accepting a packet of currency from a Soviet operative. The third showed him in what appeared to be a highly compromising situation with an individual who was distinctly not his spouse. Quote, 29 Bumpy remarked, spreading the photographs across the table as if dealing playing cards. Quote, 30. The revelation struck Vincent with the force of a physical blow. His own photographers, his own intelligence apparatus had been turned against him. How long had Bumpy orchestrated this? How long had he been walking into a snare without even realizing it? Quote, 31. Bumpy elaborated, his voice never exceeding a conversational tone. Quote, 32. Vincent's world was imploding. But the most agonizing element was Bumpy's composure. There was no animosity, no satisfaction, no discernible emotion whatsoever. Merely the cold, methodical annihilation of a man's entire existence, delivered with the same intonation one might employ to discuss meteorological conditions. Now, Bumpy stated, gathering the photographs and returning them to the envelope, we arrive at the purpose for which I am truly present this evening. He reached into his jacket one final time and produced a business card of superior quality paper with raised embossing, the kind of card that suggested substantial financial means and significant affiliations. My mother, he declared, placing the card on the table between them, instructed me that a man's vow is his commitment. She taught me that respect is the sole currency that truly holds value, and she impressed upon me that certain obligations can only be repaid in their entirety. Vincent gazed at the card, his hands trembling as he deciphered the name inscribed upon it. It was a name that caused grown men to make the sign of the cross and influential politicians to respond to telephone calls with immediate alacrity. Tomorrow morning, Bumpy announced, rising once more, you will receive a caller, a gentleman who specializes in the collection of debts that cannot be settled with monetary means. When he appears, you will present him with something quite specific. The tension in the room was stifling. Even the sound of respiration seemed excessively loud. You will extend to him an apology, Bumpy elaborated, not to me, but to my mother. You will explain to him precisely what you uttered concerning her this evening, and you will implore her forgiveness. And if that apology is not sufficiently sincere, if it does not emanate from the innermost depths of your worthless being. He left the statement incomplete. Yet everyone in the room grasped his intended meaning with perfect clarity. Vincent opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. For the first time in his adult life, he was utterly bereft of agency. The empire he had constructed, the reputation he had cultivated, the dread he had instilled, all of it was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. But as Bumpy moved towards the exit, he paused and turned back one final time. Oh, and Vincent, he remarked, that terrifying smile returning to his face, the gentleman you will encounter tomorrow, he is someone you know quite well. And with that, Bumpy Johnson exited the room, leaving behind 5 men who were just beginning to comprehend that they had been witnesses to something extraordinary. But Vincent Torino would not have ample time to reflect on his errors, because the following morning would usher in a visitor who would transform everything. They presumed they had subdued Bumpy Johnson that night. They were mistaken. They had merely awakened something considerably more perilous than they could have ever imagined. Vincent Torino scarcely slept that night. Every shadow outside his opulent estate seemed to harbor a menace. Every vehicle that passed his gates could be conveying his executioner. He dismissed his usual bodyguards, fearful they might be compromised. After all, if Bumpy had managed to influence his photographers, who else might he have swayed? By dawn, Vincent was pacing his study like a caged beast, nursing his third cup of coffee and his first whiskey of the day. The business card Bumpy had left behind rested on his mahogany desk like a detonating device. He had scrutinized that name so frequently, the characters appeared to searingly imprint themselves upon his retinas. The doorbell chimed precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. Vincent's hands trembled as he peered through the curtains. A black Cadillac was parked in his driveway, its engine still running. The chauffeur remained at the wheel, but a solitary figure stood at the front door. Tall, impeccably attired, carrying a leather satchel that seemed sufficiently valuable to sustain a family for an entire year. What caused Vincent's blood to turn to ice was not the man's appearance. It was his countenance, because he recognized that face. He had been observing it across dinner tables for the preceding 15 years. It was his own brother-in-law, Marcus Torino. Marcus was not merely family. He was Vincent's most trusted confidant, his right-hand man, the custodian of all his darkest secrets. If Marcus was present on Bumpy's behalf, it signified that the betrayal ran deeper than Vincent had ever conceived. "Greetings, Vincent," Marcus articulated upon the door's eventual opening. His voice lacked the warmth it typically possessed during familial gatherings. Quote 44. They convened in Vincent's study, the very chamber where he had devised countless illicit schemes, ordered assaults, and devastated the lives of all who had opposed him. Now it felt akin to a courtroom, and he was unmistakably the accused. "For how long?" Vincent inquired, his voice barely audible. 3 years, Marcus responded, placing his briefcase on the desk positioned between them. "Ever since you sanctioned the elimination of that journalist, the one who was posing too many inquiries regarding our maritime operations." "The journalist!" Vincent recalled him distinctly. Young, principled, the archetype of a man who believed he could dismantle the entirety of the Italian mob with nothing more than a typewriter and a fervent sense of justice. Vincent had him eliminated without a second thought. "You were unaware," Marcus continued, "but that journalist was Johnson's nephew, his sister's son, freshly graduated from Columbia Journalism School, seeking to establish his reputation." The revelation struck Vincent like a sledgehammer to the chest. All this time, he had assumed tonight's confrontation was about some casual slight. But this was not about his crude jests or prejudiced remarks. This was about kinship. This was about lineage. This was about an obligation that had been in the making for 3 years. Quote 50, Marcus recounted, opening his briefcase with deliberate precision. Quote 51. From the briefcase, Marcus extracted a substantial folder. Within it lay photographs, official documents, recorded conversations, 3 years' worth of evidence meticulously documenting every transgression, every instance of corruption, every moment of Vincent's descent into becoming precisely the sort of monster he had once vowed never to be. Quote 5:2. Marcus continued. Quote 5:3. Vincent's mouth had become completely parched. He reached for his whiskey, but his hands were trembling so violently he could not lift the glass. The singular characteristic of Johnson, Marcus stated, is his patience. He could have had you terminated that very night, could have instigated a conflict that would have convulsed this entire metropolis. But he sought something beyond retribution. He desired justice, and justice, authentic justice, necessitates considerable time for meticulous construction. The folder contained more than mere evidence of Vincent's transgressions. It comprised a comprehensive blueprint of his entire organization: names, dates, locations, bank account numbers, shipping manifests, everything the FBI would require to dismantle the Torino crime family piece by piece. But there was an additional item within that folder, something that caused Vincent's heart to cease its beating entirely. Letters penned in his own hand. Letters addressed to Maria, his sister, Marcus's wife. Letters that disclosed sentiments extending far beyond fraternal affection. Letters that would annihilate not only his reputation, but also his family. Quote 56, Marcus declared, his voice carrying a lethal composure that eerily recalled Bumpy's intonation from the preceding evening. She possesses no knowledge that her own brother has been fixated upon her since she was 16. She is ignorant of the private investigators you employed to shadow her. She is unaware of the men you had assaulted merely for extending her social invitations. The regrettable verity was finally brought to light. Vincent's protective conduct towards his sister had not stemmed from brotherly devotion. It had been possessiveness, obsession, a distorted craving that had corrupted every judgment he had rendered over the past 2 decades. Quote 58. Marcus continued. Quote 59. Here's what's going to happen. Quote 60. You're going to pen a letter, a confession, not just detailing your transgressions, but revealing who you truly are and what you've been doing to our family all these years. Quote 61. You're going to vanish tonight, forever. Because if you don't, if you're still in this city by morning, Johnson won't merely obliterate you. He'll annihilate everyone you've ever feigned caring about. Your legitimate enterprises, your political associations, your reputation. It will all be consumed by fire. Quote 62. There's a vehicle waiting outside, Marcus announced, rising and adjusting his tie. It will transport you to the docks. A freighter bound for South America departs in 2 hours. You will be on it. Vincent gazed at the confession letter, then at his brother-in-law, and finally at the photographs strewn across his desk. His entire existence, his entire self-image, reduced to mere evidence within a folder. What about my money? He inquired pathetically. My assets. Marcus offered a smile, but it was not a kind one. It was the smile of a man witnessing justice finally served. Johnson is retaining 20% as payment for services rendered. He stated the remaining 80% is being donated to journalism schools nationwide. Scholarships for aspiring reporters, young individuals aiming to improve the world. It was the perfect irony. Vincent's ill-gotten gains would now fund the very investigative journalism capable of preventing future Vincent Torinos from ascending to power. As Marcus moved towards the exit, he paused, glancing back one last time. Oh, and Vincent, he said, Johnson wanted me to relay something. He said to remember that a man's mother is sacred, even a deceased one. Hello, Vincent. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Mind if I come in? Vincent's legs nearly buckled. This was impossible. He was thousands of miles from New York, living under an assumed name in a nation where Bumpy possessed no connections, no influence, no power. Yet, here he stood, as if he owned the entire city of Buenos Aires. How? Was all Vincent managed to whisper. Bumpy stepped inside without an invitation. His eyes swept over the sparse apartment with evident disappointment. You know, Vincent, for a man who pilfered millions of dollars, you're living rather modestly. I anticipated something with a bit more flair. The how is straightforward. You see, when a man flees, he invariably repeats the same errors. He seeks out a familiar locale, somewhere that evokes memories of home. You selected Argentina because your grandmother hailed from Italy, and you assumed the culture would feel comforting. You also, Quote, 76 maintain some of your old habits. Every Tuesday morning you visit the same newsstand to purchase international papers. Every Thursday you dine at that little Italian eatery on Corrientes Avenue. And every Sunday you attend Mass at the cathedral, occupying the same pew your grandmother frequented 60 years ago. Amusing thing about running away, it grants a man time to contemplate, to reflect upon his choices, to realize precisely the kind of person he truly is. You see, Vincent, I initially believed your issue was mere arrogance, racism, the casual cruelty of a man who had forgotten his origins, but I was mistaken. Your problem runs much deeper than that. You couldn't help yourself, could you? Bumpy inquired, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine revulsion. 6 months in a new country, an opportunity to begin anew, to perhaps evolve into the man you ought to have been all along. But instead, you have become precisely what I always suspected you were, a predator. Vincent attempted to speak, to deny the accusations, but the photographs narrated a story that words could never adequately convey. He had believed himself to be cautious. He had believed himself to be astute, but every move he had made had been anticipated, documented, and preserved for this precise moment. The beauty of Argentina, Bumpy continued, spreading more photographs across the table, is that they hold a very unfavorable view of individuals who harm children. The authorities here are not quite as diplomatic as those back in New York. When they apprehend a man like you, well, let's just say the judicial system operates a little differently. 3 days ago, you had a highly illuminating conversation with a local businessman regarding the expansion of your operations. The thing about recording devices is that they do not lie. They do not embellish. They merely preserve the truth for posterity. Quote 89, what do you want? Quote 90, want? Quote 91, I want nothing from you. Vincent, you see, this meeting is not a negotiation. It is not even a confrontation. It is a funeral, your funeral. You made one fundamental error. You believed this was about respect. You assumed this was about some insult you hurled at my mother in a back room 6 months ago. But it was never about that. This was about justice. Justice for my nephew, the reporter you had killed. Justice for your sister, whom you psychologically tormented for 20 years. Justice for every child you have harmed. Every life you have destroyed. Every family you have fractured. The individuals approaching up those stairs, they are not my men. They are local law enforcement, highly dedicated officers who take child trafficking extremely seriously. They possess warrants, evidence, witnesses, everything they require to ensure you never harm another innocent person again. You know what the truly remarkable aspect is? My mother always instilled in me that evil eventually destroys itself. All one must do is possess sufficient patience to witness it unfold. Oh, Vincent, remember what I told you about respect being earned? Well, you've just learned what transpires when you forfeit it entirely. The last sight Vincent beheld as they escorted him away was Bumpy Johnson standing calmly amidst the wreckage of his apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, appearing as a man who had just personally balanced the scales of justice. The game had concluded, and Vincent Torino had finally grasped that certain debts could only be fully settled. But even as the police vehicle pulled away, even as his world disintegrated around him for the final time, Vincent couldn't help but ponder. How long had Bumpy been orchestrating this moment? How far did his influence truly extend? He was about to discover that Bumpy Johnson's reach permeated deeper than he had ever imagined, and his ultimate lesson in respect was only just beginning. 10 years later, Vincent Torino died alone in an Argentine maximum security prison, not from violence, not from retribution, but from something far more devastating for a man like him: complete irrelevance. The newspapers didn't even publish an obituary. The criminal underworld had forgotten his name. He had become precisely what he had always feared most: nothing. But his story persisted, whispered in back rooms and private clubs across 3 continents. It became the cautionary narrative mothers shared with their sons, bosses with their lieutenants, and anyone possessing influence with those who might forget the fundamental principles of respect. On the morning Vincent passed, a single black rose was delivered to his grave. No card, no message, just a floral tribute informing all who needed to know that Bumpy Johnson remembered, even in death. Even after a decade of punishment, the debt had been marked as fully paid. Back in Harlem, Bumpy's empire had expanded beyond anyone's wildest imagination, but it was not founded on fear or brutality like Vincent's had been. It was built upon something infinitely more potent: loyalty earned through respect, power wielded with wisdom, and a code of honor that never wavered, never broke, never compromised. The account of what transpired that night at Ralph's restaurant became legend. But the true narrative, the one that mattered, was what happened subsequently: how Bumpy transformed that moment of disrespect into a masterclass in strategic thinking that would shape organized crime for generations. Marcus Torino, Vincent's former brother-in-law, ascended to become one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants, not through coercion or blackmail, but because he had witnessed true leadership firsthand. The night Marcus entered Vincent's study with that folder, he wasn't merely delivering Bumpy's ultimatum. He was applying for a new position. "Do you know the difference between a boss and a leader?" Marcus would explain to new recruits years later. "A boss demands respect. A leader earns it. Johnson never demanded anything from anyone. He simply demonstrated who he was, and you either respected it or you didn't. But if you didn't, you'd best be prepared for the repercussions. Listen to this. This is what happens when a man forgets that respect flows in both directions, when he believes his position grants him the right to diminish others rather than elevate them." Quote 107. "The art of war," quote 108, "isn't about fighting battles. It's about ensuring your adversary defeats himself. Give a man enough rope and he'll hang himself. Give him enough time and he'll reveal his true nature. Do you wish to know the genuine secret? Respect is not something you seize, it's something you bestow, and the more you give, the more you receive." Vincent never comprehended this. He believed respect was derived from diminishing others, but true respect is about augmenting others. The lesson resonated through generations. In boardrooms and back alleys, in political chambers and prison cells, men would recount the saga of Vincent Torino and Bumpy Johnson, how arrogance encountered wisdom, how cruelty met justice, how a man who disregarded the fundamental tenets of human decency learned them through the most arduous means possible. And in Harlem, within a modest apartment above a jazz club, an elderly woman named Margaret Johnson lived comfortably for the remainder of her days, never realizing that her son had avenged an insult she had never even heard. Because in Bumpy's world, a mother's honor was sacred, even if she remained unaware of its defense. The most significant triumphs, after all, are those that unfold in silence. The game had concluded. Respect had prevailed, and the legend of Bumpy Johnson continued to flourish, one honorable act at a time. That is the power of playing the long game. That is the strength of never forgetting one's origins. And that is why, even today, elderly men in Harlem still recount tales of the night someone made the error of disrespecting Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's mother. Certain debts can only be fully settled. Certain lessons can only be learned the hard way. And some individuals, having crossed particular boundaries, discover that redemption is not always attainable. But justice is always within reach. One simply needs to be patient enough to witness it.